Welcome everyone to the Voice of Meaning. Today's program, we're going to continue to introduce my friend Ulrich Semrau, continuation from our last interview that was titled, You Can't Make This Stuff Up. So if you haven't seen it yet, please subscribe and watch the last interview, which was extremely interesting. And we're going to continue on with Ulrich's story. So Ulrich, we left off with your father's stress in having to live in a POW camp in the United Kingdom until a couple of years after World War II. What happened next, and how did your parents get back together and create you later on?
Well, thank you, Neil. I want to start with the way I look at our lives. There's a timeline. There's what was before us and what was after us, or what will be for us. And at some point, we're born, sort of pop out into reality, and we eventually will learn about our past, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and as we go through our lives, we create our future. We move from the now to the future. So that's sort of the framework that I think about all of this. So to answer your question, I was born 5 years after the end of World War II. And I was born in a town in Bavaria called Straubing, which is on the Czech border. And well, it used to be the Czechoslovakian border, but it's now the Czech border. And I was actually born a little bit outside, in a place called Neu Steinach, which was a castle. It sounds grandiose, but this castle was the last official headquarters for the SS. And as they were disbanding and going into the Alps with the idea of fighting a guerrilla war with the Allies, they burned the place down because they had all their records there and they didn't want evidence. So when I was born, there was just the whole castle. There was just the tower that was there, plus outbuildings, and that's where my parents lived. My aunt was the first one to arrive there with her two daughters. She walked from Danzig, which is now Gdansk on the Baltic Sea, all the way down to Straubing. And her son, her eldest, was 15, and he had been recruited to be in the final battle in Eastern Europe. And he was shot, but was taken prisoner and ended up in Denmark. So they released him after he was healed, and he made his way to where his mom was. So then that was in 1945. A few years later, my dad was released from POW camp in Scotland, and he had finally found out where my mom was. He didn't know who was alive, what the reality of his life was going to be. So he found her in Berlin, in the Russian sector, and he was strongly advised not to go to the Russian sector because they were recapturing released German POWs and sending them to Siberia. But my dad wanted to get to my mom, so he went there in the middle of the night, and they reunited, and he got her out of the Russian sector, the Soviet sector, and took her to the American sector, and then Straubing was part of that. And so that's where he ended up, because he had gotten letters from his sister that's where they were. So now the family was reunited, and there were some lessons that have created meaning in my life from my dad from that period of time. So he shows up, all he has in the world is his POW assigned clothes. He had dyed the shirt so that the POW on the back wasn't so prominent. And then he started with absolutely nothing. He found out his parents were gone, his brother was gone, his brother's family were gone, but he had my mom and he had his sister. So that's where he began. Well, shortly after he arrived there, the new German government, which was formed in 1948, the new West German government, changed the currency from the Reichsmark to the new mark. And suddenly everybody woke up and they all had 48 marks. It didn't matter if you had 1,000,000 marks before, you had 48 marks the next day. So a lot of the guys went to the pub and they bought 48 marks worth of beer. They didn't have it. They were shell shocked still. I mean, this was 48, not that many years after the war. There was still a lot of confusion and the result of the war and the trauma and all that stuff. But my dad, and the other thing is that before that, there was nothing in the stores. If you went to the black market, you could get things, but that's why they changed the currency, was to destroy the black market, so that they have a real national economy again. And so my dad, so the day that the new currency was in place, the stores were full. They had everything. So he went to the store and bought a shovel and a rake, because he had noticed that the castle grounds had an old nursery that had been neglected during the war. The glass in the greenhouses were destroyed, broken. So he asked the owner, the Baron, whether he could use that nursery to grow food for the refugee camp. Okay, that was the answer. Okay, so with his shovel and his rake, he went to work. He got some glass, fixed the greenhouses, found a tiller. I still have a picture of my cousin working the tiller, and they started raising food, vegetables, and things for the people that were living at that camp. Now, my dad, my mom, my cousins, my aunt, and another 11 people lived in one room. It wasn't that everybody had their own rooms. They were crammed. So for my dad, that was motivation. He needed to change the situation. So his plan, I think he had in his head, was get the nursery going. And then any of the surplus food that wasn't being used in the camp, he sold at the town square. They had every week they had a market. So he was beginning to do all right. He had a 3-wheeled pickup that he called Oscar. So my mom went to the clinic. I was about to show up, and my dad was still working in the greenhouses, and he got the call that I arrived. So he jumped into his into Oscar, which only would start if it went downhill. Compression start. So he got it going, went into town, and that's when I met my dad. So the lesson that I learned from that experience, from that history, was no matter how little you have, no matter what your life condition is, there's always potential. There's always a way out. You just have to have the courage to do it. My dad could have very easily become an alcoholic, been on the dole, and my parents could have divorced. I mean, that's a history that didn't happen.
Ulrich, when did your dad tell you this story, or how did you find out about it?
Well, when I was 4, if I have my recollections, because at this point I have no one left to confirm a lot of the stories that he sat me down. He said, you have to remember the past. You have to remember where the family came from, what we lost, what could have been your home if things had been normal. And that was the beginning of him telling me the stories. It's like the grandfather around the campfire telling the stories. And I remembered them. And as I got older, I'm quite sure that motivated me to become a teacher, to become a therapist. I have a degree in psychology and education, and interests in many, many, many things. As those are just a tiny fraction of the books I have.
That's wonderful. And you had mentioned to me that there were a couple other lessons that you learned from this past. So please continue the narrative.
Yeah. Let's see. So I learned, no matter where you find yourself in life, look for potential. So my dad found out that the town of Straubing was going to have an election for their city council. And with the position would come an apartment in town. So here was an opportunity, getting out of the camp, getting out of that room with 17 people, most of which they didn't know until then. So he suggested to the city council that he would run as a representative for the camp. And he was elected, and we got the apartment. That was a big move for my mom. Now the apartment was in the town square, which is a fairly large area, and the story that I got from my dad was that it had once been the home of one of the early councilmen in the 1500s, whose name was Ulrich Schmiedel, who was a minor nobleman of that era, and he joined up with the conquistadors and went to what became Argentina. And they built a settlement which they called Buenos Aires. But of course, the locals at that time, the indigenous people, weren't all that happy to have these people who just sort of grab land from them. So they besieged the settlement, and the settlement almost died. They were very close to losing. And Ulrich organized a defense of this against the siege, and they won. He saved the colony. And so because of that, they made him the first mayor of the town, the settlement of Buenos Aires. Okay, so now he comes back to Straubing. He had been born in a small village just not too far from the town, and because he was a adventurer and had experience in government, they appointed him on the city council, and his home became a traditional part of the city, that whenever someone was elected in a particular position in the city council, they would get that apartment. And his name was Ulrich. So there's a plaque above the window, below the window of the second floor where we lived, and it says Ulrich Schmiedel. So my dad says, well, they got it half right, since my name was Ulrich.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not sure whether I was named after him. Could have been. Anyway, so that's the other part of the story is, don't give up, no matter where you find yourself, and always look out for opportunities to create a new life, and to create your life. So I've taken those lessons at heart. There have been times when not necessarily that I had almost nothing, but close. And there were times when I thought my life was over because, this happened or this happened. But I always found an opportunity that I remembered. Don't give up. And those were two major life lessons at that point. Now, they also, because my dad said, you need to remember, you need to be a witness to remember. And so I've always framed myself, well, what do I need to know to remember? What do I need to know? So I studied history. I'm heavy into the sciences. I started out with one language, like we all do. That was German. But then there's a part in between, but I'll go to, my dad always wanted to, he was an adventurer. He also always wanted to go somewhere else. And during the war, he had wanted to end up in German West Africa and become a pioneer. So he took classes in building cabins and the skills you need to be a pioneer. But so at that time, they were going to go to Venezuela. So I was 4 or 5 at the time, and we had classes. We had one of my dad's students, who became a teacher later, students from South America teach us Spanish. So Spanish is my second language. Well, that worked all right until my mom found out about the snakes. And that became a no-go. But there was a particular letter that they got from some German immigrants who lived in the Amazon, and this lady was in her rocking chair in their house cabin, and when she woke up, there was this big snake coiled up in her lap. Well, that put an end to the South American adventure. And so my dad thought, well, we've always had relatives in the United States. The first Semraus came to the United States in the 1740s. So we thought, all right, that's probably the safest place. There aren't that many snakes. So that's how I ended up in the United States. So English became my third language. So, and which is now the only language that I'm actually really fluent in.
So a little bit about your memories of how they moved from Germany to the United States, and a little bit about your life after that. What stands out?
Well, we crossed the Atlantic on it was a victory ship. It was a naval ship that was built during the war, partly out of concrete, I think. That was a troop carrier, and we were the last group of refugees, German refugees from the east, no longer was part of Germany, to be allowed in the United States. Back then, they had quotas, and so we got on the ship, and my learning of English started on the ship. They had, of course, there were a lot of kids, so there was an area where the parents could drop the kids off for so they could have some time for themselves. And I remember an incident where I was on a rocking chair. Now, this was in the middle of storm season in the Atlantic. The ship was sealed off. It was going like this. There were bags for seasickness all along the railings. And so my mom comes to pick me up, and I'm on this rocking chair bouncing around. The ship is bouncing around. She looks at me, turns around, and has a moment. And so that was one of the experiences on the ship that I remember. And the other was we watched American cartoons. There was this big room that I remember, and because the ship was going like this, there were no chairs. We were on cardboard laid out on the floor, and when the ship was going this way, we go, and we went, the ships, we'd all go this way. But we watched the cartoons, all the Disney cartoons, Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse, and that's where I started learning English. So by the time we got to the United States, I knew a few words. My parents spoke English before. The dialect from Danzig was heavily influenced by English because it was a Hanseatic League city associated with London. And so learning English wasn't that difficult for them.
Do you think your mother had some anxiety dating back to her experience of being torpedoed on the Goya?
I think that had a lot to do. I don't remember. I only have a few visual shots in my memory of that trip, and she wasn't. I don't think she was very present. I mean, I was in the room with her with another woman and her daughter. My dad was with all the men down in the hull down below in hammocks, and so I would suspect that she had this a lot of anxiety around that, having been one of 4 survivors of a torpedoed ship with over 8,000 people on it. But that didn't become clear to me until much later, and I've read up on that particular sinking, so I've got a reasonable idea of what was going on at the time and where it happened and why it happened and all that stuff.
Did you end up in Ellis Island when you reached the States?
Nope, Ellis Island had already been closed.
So where were you processed?
New York Harbor. I have a picture of me sitting on a crate with tags with numbers on them and my name, and my mom sitting next to me. And when we came over all we had was one crate that was 18 inches by 18 inches by 3 feet, and a smaller one. And all of our belongings at that point were in those crates. My godfather actually kept those until just before he passed away, some 20 years ago. So every so often I would go into the barn, his barn, and I would find the box, and I would remember things. So we were in New York, and my cousin had already, my aunt's oldest, had already come to the United States with his new wife, and he was still very young. I think he was like 20 years old. So we stayed with them for a few days until we took the train and went to Minneapolis, and then from Minneapolis we went to a little place called Peacock Lake up in the lake country, and the community had sponsored us. They had paid for our trip, and they had a job for my dad. They had a house for us. They had a welcoming party at the Lutheran church, and each room in the church was a room in the house, and we were just, my parents were just amazed with the abundance of things, and they were amazed of how generous Americans were.
And why did your family didn't stay in Minnesota for very long? You moved to,
No, we my godparents were in Bremerton in Washington State, and they lived right on the Hoods Canal. They had a real nice place, and so for Christmas that year we went to visit them. It happened to be one of the warmest winters in Washington in decades, which was opposite to what Peacock Lake was. I mean, it was the coldest on record. It was like 60 below in a few days, and 6 feet of snow, and there are stories there. Anyway, yeah. So we went there, and my dad was a landscape architect. A cold, snowy place was not necessarily the best place for a landscape architect to make a living. So my godmother arranged for him to interview with a landscaping company, and then they decided, okay, we're going to move. So we went back to Minnesota. We went into the house. My dad had forgotten to drain the toilet box, the water box, and so it had frozen, of course, and it was just a block of ice there. So he yelled at my mom and said, "Don't unpack, we're leaving." So that's when we came to Washington State, and most of my growing up years and my adult years I've been here in Washington.
very interesting. Ulrich, you told me about your interest in scuba diving, which was, I think, very unusual in the 60s, and a very, very serious accident that you encountered that you're lucky to have survived. Would you like to talk about that, please?
Yeah. Wind forward, I'm 18 years old, and I don't know how many people remember a person by the name of Dixie Lee Ray. She was a professor at the University of Washington. She became the first female governor of a state in the United States. And she had a show on public TV about marine biology. And I watched every episode. I got so excited about marine biology, since my favorite teacher was also a biologist. And that led to my interest in scuba diving, because I wanted to go down underwater and see the fauna and the animals and the sharks and the fish, and I even swam with killer whales. So we were up in the San Juan Islands. I was part of a group, And our fearless leader had worked with Jacques Cousteau, who was a really big thing at that time. He had several TV series and shows, movies about the undersea world, and it was just fascinating to me. Actually, I think it actually goes back with what was his name? There was a TV show about a diver, and
Oh, was that Sea Hunt?
sea hunt,
Yeah, Mike
and,
Nelson. I remember that.
and that pre was before the Cousteau. But anyway, so we had this diving group, and because of Spence's connection with Cousteau and the Conch Shelf Project, which was figuring out how to live underwater in these structures. Cousteau sent all of us his signature red caps, diving caps. And so we were up in the San Juan Islands, and we were experimenting with hookah. Hookahs were a air pump on the surface with hoses connected to the divers. And so we were down at 110 feet, and my diving partner, who was attached to me, had just been certified as a scuba diver the day before. So that was okay. But when you're in a life-threatening situation, you begin to think about maybe that's not the best thing that could have happened. And so we were down there, and suddenly no air. So this stuff goes through my head. First was air expands as you go up. So I expelled all my air. Well, I wasn't going up because I had a heavy lead diving belt on, and I was too cheap to just let go of it. If I had let go of it, I would have gone up, and I would have been to the surface in a few minutes. So as time went on, I was beginning to get there with no air. So I was also worried about the guy that was hanging on to me, and is he going to panic and drag me down? So I pass out. It's all black, and a few minutes later, I'm on the surface, and I wake up. My diving partner sort of slapped me in the face and woke. I came back. Now, whether I was actually dead or almost dead, I don't know. But it was something that it changed my view of diving. I was much more careful after that. So that's another story. There are a lot of places where I could have either not come into existence or could have stopped my existence. That's the way I've always been.
So, any more lessons you want to share with our watchers before we end this section of our?
Well, I have a quote that sort of ties a lot of my stories, and there are many more. Like all of us have lots of stories in our lives, and as we get older, hopefully we have grandkids or neighborhood kids that we can tell these stories to as points of lessons of things that they should learn. But so providing meaning. This is a book called The Power of Purpose. That, when you have a book and you keep coming back to it, and you have all kinds of markers on it, it tells you that maybe what the book is about is is useful and meaningful to you. And the subtitle is creating meaning in your life and work. Anyway, so providing meaning. The following a deep call in our lives means that something, an aim, a passion, an interest, a problem, an idea, attracts us enough to move us to action on its behalf, and is important enough so that the focusing of it directs our actions and provides our lives with a sense of meaning. So a lot of the things that I think about in terms of my life, and I journal every morning. I've been doing that for the last 50 years. I know I've got around 400 journals, of which only about 150, 200 actually still exist, I think. Maybe someday I'll find the rest of them, who knows. But I record these things. The core identity for me, because of my dad's comment when I was very impressionable, is to remember, to be a witness, because a lot of things that happened in his time period in our early life is now happening again in the world, and there are lessons from the past that may be useful to make it through this time period.
Ulrich, thank you so much for your narrative. I continue to be moved by it. You shared with me that you're going to have a new handle besides the Republic Washington Town Philosopher, and would you share with the group what that new handle is?
Well, I guess as of today, I'm going to become Ulrich the Elder. Not the older, but the elder. There's a difference. I'm not old. I'm just an elder.
Well, thank you for your eldering. If you haven't already subscribed to the Voice of Meaning, please do so. You can ring the bell so you can be notified when we have other interviews. There are many of us who have very, very interesting narratives. We would love to interview you. We call these meaning memoirs. We'd love to, in the comments, hear where you feel your voice of meaning comes from. This is a beginning of a project that Ulrich and I hope that will last many years. We appreciate any feedback, support, criticism, whatever, in the comments, and we hope to hear from a lot of you. So
even though we're elders, we still have much to learn from the experiences and the stories of others. So this project is as much for us to learn as it is for the viewers. We invite you to join us on this journey.
thank you, Ulrich, and we will sign out.